reluctant at first, and perhaps a little nervous. That is why when I phoned up the Sloans and asked them, it was a refreshing and delightful change when Jim just paused for a millisecond and then cheerfully responded, "Sure, I think I've got enough stories to fill a night." So without further ado, I want to welcome Melba and Jim Sloan. Thank them so much for coming, and let the stories begin.
There you are. The mic is yours, Jay. Melba's in charge.
Until I'm used to doing this. Well, Ginny asked me to talk about the Nelson family, and I happen to be the fifth generation from John Nelson. And
Would you talk to the mic, please? We can't hear you. Can't hear you.
So John Nelson was my great-great-grandfather, and John Nelson and his wife, Margaret Johnson, came from Ireland in 1819, and being granted land on the west side of the Otonabee River of Smith Township, Concession 7, he felled trees and built his first big shanty. West side of the river was called Nelson Falls, after John Nelson. Later, a bridge was built in 1833 across the Otonabee River, linking the Douro side of the settlement, and then they called the village Harriet Falls, and sometime later was called Lakefield. John had two sons, Joseph and Samuel, born in the 1830s. They owned property west to what is now 507 Highway and south from the bridge to the 7th concession. Samuel built a new home in 1881 on the property near bridge on hill along the side of the river and named it Victoria Lodge. When Samuel died in 1904, the house was sold to the Bravenders family, who altered it by adding large verandas and balconies to the second and third floors. It certainly looked beautiful after that. In recent years, it has been converted into the Lakefield Private Hospital. Samuel married Eliza Bell Nelson, born in Otonabee Township. I don't have to use that.
Sorry.
Okay. In recent years, it has been converted into the Lakefield Private Hospital. Samuel married Eliza Bell Nelson, born in Otonabee Township in Peterborough County. She was the daughter of, who came to Otonabee from Scotland about 1820. So there's the two Nelsons, one from Ireland and one from Scotland. Sam and Eliza Bell had two sons and 5 daughters: William, John, Milton, Anne, Jane, May, Mary, Tyler, Margaret, and Agnes. Bear with me. Lakefield's private hospital resided on Smith Street in Lakefield after they sold the they moved from the tourist home to Smith Street in Lakefield on the property owned by Dr. Gassel. In 1908, he traded his home for William True traded his home for a farm in Smith Township on the 15th concession owned by A.E. Kennedy. Frank William lived here until his death in June 19th, 1954. His wife died October 24th, 1947. Their daughter, Greta Pavey, my mother, did reside on the farm until her death, September 1994. Now on to, then on the other side of the family, on Grandpa Trude's side, his father was William Trude, Tiverton, Devonshire, England, and his mother was Elizabeth Down, 1868. She was also from Liverton, Devonshire, England. And the daughter, Henrietta, was born in August 1847 in Tiverton, Devonshire, England. May 15, 1870, she married Frederick Walden in England and immediately set sail for Canada, traveling by vessel, France, taking 15 days crossing the Atlantic. Arriving in Toronto and staying there 1 year, came to Lakefield, where Mr. Walden had a butcher business for 20 years. They and family moved to Douro Township and farmed for 19 years. They would move back to Lakefield in 1911, residing here until death. Daughter Annie was born in Tiverton, Devonshire, educated there, and came to Lakefield, Canada, the 1880s. She married Samuel Legault, and they resided at Raiden Manor, which they purchased from Strickland family. Mr. Legault owned and operated the original frame structure power plant until about 1920, where it burned down and he sold out to hydroelectric. He remained superintendent of the plant until his death in 1931. Annie died in 1944, and a daughter, Elizabeth, better known as Bessie, was born in Tiverton, Devonshire, England, and came to Lakefield, Canada in the 1880s. She made her home here with her sister and her husband, Annie and Sam Legault, until her death in 1928. Sarah Sloan was born in Tiverton, Devonshire, England too. She married Richard Pemberthy and lived here her time in life. A son, Frank William, my grandfather, was born July 27th, Tiverton, Devonshire, England, and he was my grandfather and came to Canada at 6 years old with his sister and husband, Henrietta and Frederick Walden. He stayed the year in Toronto and came to Lakefield, where he received his education. He started in the butcher business with Frederick Walden at 14 years of age. He continued the business for 31 years. He married Jane Ann Nelson, daughter of Samuel Nelson, April 25th, 1888, at their home. Now, my grandfather continued butchery. Even when he went to the farm, he was killing beef. And his son, Sam, took over, Sam Trude, and Barb Trude lives in Lakefield. And then Harold Trude took over from Sam, that was his son. And some of my cousins now on the Trude side are butchers. So we appreciate my grandfather very much. That's just I have a picture of Victoria Lodge built in 1877. It's in our history book. Nelson Falls to Lakefield, built by Samuel Nelson, was known as Lakefield Private Hospital. We have some furniture from the home. Sam Nelson was born in 1831, same year as Samuel Strickland started his settlement in Douro, side of the Otonabee River. In 1877, Samuel Nelson, when reached 18, received his inheritance, so he put his farm up for sale, his farm on lot 28 in the 7th concession of Smith, 100 acres. Sam still retained property in the village, including a separate schoolyard, Kingdom subdivision, and private hospital. And number 7 school was on John Nelson's property. So we got around looking after education. That's my little spiel for tonight.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Jim Sloan, and I was born in 1932. My father was Everett Garfield Sloan, son of Dave Sloan, son of Sam Sloan. And Sam Sloan immigrated to about 1831 and received the Crown grant of land in Dummer, where my father was raised, and I spent many summers. Now, my mother was Algina Bone, and she had several brothers and sisters. And my great-great-grandfather was Francis Crow, who settled at Crow's Landing on Stony Lake, and still known as Crow's Landing today. And my great-great-grandfather Sloan came from Monaghan, in Monaghan Township in Ireland. So I guess I got a little Irish blood in me. I was born in Warsaw, right along the river, and there's an old restaurant in Warsaw as you leave Warsaw towards Bethel Church. And today it was, originally it was a school, and my mother and several of her brothers and sisters went to that school. I was delivered by Dr. Monroe, the famous doctor in Warsaw. He delivered probably 5,000 children, and mostly at home, except that Hilliard Clemens, a very smart man in Warsaw, in 1936, I was standing in front of Vivian Jackson's barber shop, and he drove up in this animal. It was a star car, and it had skis on the front of it, and I thought, boy, that's different. And he had a track on the back of it. And he used that to deliver Mr. Monroe, Dr. Monroe, to Peterborough and the pregnant woman to have a baby, because there wasn't any hospitals in Warsaw. I still remember the names of a lot of Warsaw residents who, it seemed like as a child, the older people were very appealing to me because they had so much wisdom, and they were just characters in a way. I remember some of the older residents. Was Rolly Payne. Now, Rolly Payne was a man, a great carpenter. He built arenas all over this country. Warsaw, he built them in Lakefield, he built them in Norwood. And sadly to say, a lot of them were torn down because he used a lot of hemlock lumber, and it would crack and split. And of course, the building inspector would come in and condemn them, had to tear them down. And there was Rolly Payne, and there was two Paynes in Warsaw. There was Alan Payne, the farmer, and then Alan Payne, the sawmill operator. And his son still operates a sawmill just north of the Warsaw Caves today. It was Mark Longsbury, quite a character. His mother was Tilly Longsbury. There was Frank Sidey. He owned a little hardware store there. And that's the first time I ever stole anything. I went into the hardware store and I saw all these nails there. And I thought, boy, they're nice. So I filled my pockets up. A little wooden barrel, you know. And when I got home, Dad says, where'd you get the nails? And I told him. He said, you get right back there and put them back and count them. He said, that man wants those nails. So I had to take them back. But while I was in Frank Sidey's store there, he had a nice little outhouse at the back there, and somebody had just come into the store complaining about this back house. And he says, I'm going to tear that right down, he says, and build a new one someday. And so my brother and I went home and got two hammers, and we started to tear it down. we had doing a good job on it when they caught us. And they rebuilt the thing up, they didn't tear it down at all. Anyway, I was in swimming just in the old mill in Lakefield there in Warsaw, and I was only 4 or 5 years old, and I got caught into the current somehow that was going into the mill. And I was just about ready to get sucked up against this great trash grate, they called. And Frank Sidey grabbed me and pulled me out. Well, I thought that's nice of him. He's not alive, I thank him today. And there was Dave Miller, and there was George Weller had a barber shop there. He lived out in what they call Weller's Hill, just going out of Warsaw. And I'm talking about Warsaw because these are all my memories until I was 6 or 7 years old. And I don't know how I can remember back that far, you know. That's, how many years ago was that? Anyway, that's over 70 years. And anyway, there was Hilliard Clemens, a very smart blacksmith. He could make anything, and he made this snowmobile. He also built a dam on the Indian River in Warsaw. This was in the 30s, before any hydro was in Warsaw. And anyway, he said to my dad, he says, and a bunch of the local businessmen, they wanted to build a rink of some kind in Warsaw to play hockey. So, right where the Lions Park is today in Warsaw, if you know anything about Warsaw, there was a kind of a swamp there, and all these men went in there and literally hauled the logs and the stumps out of that spot, and they built a kind of an outdoor rink with boards around it with help from other people, and Hilliard says, you build that rink and I'll put lights on. So he ran a line all the way from his power station down to this arena, and I guess it lasted for several years until they got the hydro, and then they finally got an arena in Warsaw years later. But for years, that's all they did was play in an outdoor rink there. And my teacher was Miss Burgess in Warsaw. I think I only went to school 2 years there. I don't know whether they kicked me out. I don't know. We came to Peter, to Lakefield. That was it. But Dad had taught school in let me see, down in Durrow, and he even played baseball with Bill Towns, one of the original Towns was in Durrow. Keevan, remember Bill Towns?
Indeed I do.
Yeah, and he taught down in Durrow, just below Durrow there, a ways, for 6 years, I believe. And then he came to Lakefield as a principal in 1939. And we moved to, anybody in Lakefield know where the school hill is? Yeah, well, okay, we moved on top of that hill. I believe it was a house that Stan Winder had owned or lived in. And we didn't live there long, and I think John Daring, who became a judge down near London, Ontario, bore it with us for a while. And then we moved to a house across where John Deck was raised, a little white house where Jack Brown lived for years. He was a reeve of Bancroft for years. And then we moved up to where the Bonds lived, right at the top end of Strickland Street, a great big brick home up there. We lived there, and we had 2 cows, 2 pigs, and Mom had 100 hens and a big garden. And she worked hard, I'm telling you. And one of the pigs fell down the old saddle foundation, and that was a job for Stan Richardson and a bunch of guys. 200-pound pig, they're off at any time. So, anyway, I attended Lakefield Public School, and of course my dad was principal. I guess he was principal there for around 25 years, but anyway, anything that happened out in the schoolyard in the way of nonsense or fighting or bullying, anything at all. Oh, Sloan did. You can imagine? Here you're getting blamed for something, and your father's the principal. Well, he couldn't come up and side with me, you know, because that would be bias. And anyway, I'd get up and he'd call me up and he'd take me in the office and going to give me the strap. Well, he didn't hit me very hard, but he says, you know, Jim, he says, I was looking out the window and you didn't do it. But some of the kids did get the strap, and I don't know. I've got the strap lots of times in school and at home too. And when I got her at school, I got her again when I got home. And, you know, I've told Aileen Young I still got the odd bruise on my arms, but it hasn't killed me yet. And hopefully it's made me a better person. How many people have got the strap at school? Only 2 or 3 people. I'm kind of an oddball. But Dad was very active in public life in Wakefield. He coached hockey until Mom got mad because he wouldn't be home till 7 o'clock. He started a town loop in Wakefield in the old arena, I believe on Colburn Street. Is that right, Neil? The old arena's on Colburn Street?
Yeah, Colburn Street.
And, you know, that arena was still standing after they built a couple of new ones, wasn't it? They couldn't knock it down, but he had a town loop, he called it, and he had something like 200 boys playing hockey. Kevin, you remember that. And he divided them all into teams, and he did his best to make every team like kind of equal. No team better than the other team. And then he had a whole schedule set up, and you played by that schedule, and you had a lot of fun. And that old arena was really something. And he was president of Lions Club, and he campaigned for a new arena. He campaigned for a new curling rink. And Bill Grant was reeve here. He set up a committee, and they canvassed the whole town. Dad was on one of the committees to canvass for water and sewer, because Dad was getting pretty tired of carrying a slop pail out the back into a box where the honey diggers would take it later, you know. And it was really something, you know, in those days, because everybody had a, what do you call it, a back house, and you had a box in it. And up until 1945, that was all cleaned by people who quoted on it, so usually Withers Brothers, to clean the back house box up. And it wasn't a nice job, but it had to be done. And I can remember just, well, on Queen Street right here, and they were coming along and they were cleaning houses, probably the back of where, what's his name lived across the street here. And anyway, we were coming along, a bunch of boys, and we start yelling at them, and, oh, what's that smell? We'd say, gee, what's that? What's going on here? And, you know, after a while, they got tired of us kind of making fun of them, you know, and they were just doing their job. Well, anyway, they took after us. Well, it was Eugene and Payne and I, and Eugene ran across the road to where Curtins lived. Jack Curtin and Dorothy Curtin lived in a big white house across the road. And he ran in over there, and he got up in the veranda, and he ran in, he started yelling, Mama, Mama, Mommy, Mommy. And holy jumps, they had a big holy dog there, and he'd come running out of him, and the guy caught him right on the veranda, and he just took his old turkey mitt and he rubbed it on his face. Well, that was awful. But I even headed down this street. This right here. I headed down there as hard as I could go, and the other guy was after me. And there's a Mrs. Grills where I took a couple of music lessons off just down the street here. She taught piano. And you remember her, that Ron, John? Anyway, I thought I'd just duck in behind your house because I knew there was a gate there and I could get into the backyard pretty fast. And when I turned left quick to make a run, he had a shovel full of this stuff, and he threw it at me. And it missed me, thank God. And it hit the side of Mrs. Grill's clapboard white house. Well, oh, what a mess. And she was upset. She come out to see what the noise was. And she was really upset. I don't blame her a bit. I'd have been more upset if it had hit me. But anyway, I remember coming to Lakefield, and it was a very strange feeling to come to a new town. And after the war was over, 1945 or so, all these guys back to town. They were veterans coming home. And I didn't know any of them because they were brand new to the town, you know. The people like Chuck Birch and Hoppy Hopkins and a lot of guys like that. And most of them tried to start up new businesses, but I remember one incident that this Chuck Birch, he's quite a big, tall lad, red hair, and he come up after school one day and we were playing football. And he said, "Let me look at that football for a minute." And he grabbed it with his big hand. And he could throw that twice as far as anybody else in our team. And I thought, boy, this guy must be really good. So anyway, we started to play football. We were using the uniforms that they had put aside in this old locker down in the school. Football uniforms, and they didn't smell too good by then, but we wore them anyway, and because we had nothing else to wear, and it was great fun. But as I come down the street, I lived up on Strickland Street for years. What used to be the old LeMay house, and what's his? The guy that used to own used to be president of. The Nephilim company at one time.
Kilbarn? Kilbarn?
No. Kilbon.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he was one of the original guys to, what was he? He wanted to get the sewer into Lakefield too. Yeah. The water in the sewer, because it was bad. The water was bad. The wells were contaminated. And come down Strickland Street, hit Queen Street there, and of course, there was a lot of businesses. Hoppy Hopkins and what was his name? Shorty Charlton had just built a brand new service station right on the corner of Queen and Strickland. And, you know, they had to get going again as some kind of business. They're coming back after 5 or 6 years fighting. And so I'd come down the street, and there was another Hopkins had a garage right where the service station is, up at the far end of town now. And his sons were Reg Hopkins and Ray Hopkins and Milton Hopkins. He was killed out near the Grove School, hit a tree. And then we keep coming along, and there used to be, the hotel was next. You cross the railway tracks, and then there was a hotel there, the Lakefield Hotel. And there wasn't much doing there. I just kind of look it over and keep going. There's a blank lot. Then there was a box factory there during the war. And they built all these great, big, long, kind of like timbers round it on a big lathe. And they were mounted on guns during the war. And they had the shipping boxes out in front. And we'd get in one of these boxes at night, and we'd get an old wallet, lay it out on the sidewalk and put a black string along the back of the sidewalk. And we'd get in this box and wait for some guy come along and reach down, pick the wallet up, and we'd pull it away from him. And this old guy laughed, and he heard us laughing. He said, "That's the best joke I've ever had pulled on me." No, I thought he was going to kill us, but he didn't. He was having fun. It made us walk for him, you know. And then we come on down in the street, and there wasn't any businesses until you pretty well got to, the funeral home, I guess. But I used to know everybody that lived in every house and what their names were, like starting with Curtins and Jimmy Simpson and Dr. Fraser and all those people along there. You knew everybody in those days, but today I can't tell you who lives where or what their name is. And if I did know, I wouldn't recognize them. And we keep on going until we got to a store, Percy, no, I guess it was a little church there, the Christ Church there, where Garnet works. And that was one place that was nice to us because there'd been several scout troops in Lakefield. And I believe Ken Jenkins and Wesley, anyway, Jack Millie was in on it too. And they were scoutmasters, and they started Sea Scouts there. And so we had a lot of good times in that building when the Sea Scouts were there. And we used to go on little trips. We'd go over to the islands and help clean up the brush over in the islands in Lakefield here. And anyway, kept on going, and we come down the street there, and I guess it passed. Where else is that? Is that come next door? Be the Spence's store. Still a brick building there today. I forget what's in it. It was George and Percy Spence, and they had Gene Spence and Fred Spence, several children, and one of them had married a Little, which was Cephas Little's sister. And Porky Little used to run the Pine Grove Cheese Factory. And then we keep on going, and just past the Spence's store was the Royal Bank. And at the Royal Bank, there was a man who was bank manager, and his name was Campbell. And he had a son named Jim Campbell, who I was in the same class at school with. And I thought, oh, he's a good lad. And he said, and they had a radio. Imagine that, they had a radio at the house. And he says, come on home with me. And he says, we'll listen to the Shallow Nose. And I like that program. That's an old program. And anyway, what happened, this is the first time I met this guy. I'll tell you who he was, but he got on the crossbar on my bicycle, and we rode down to his house, and we went in behind Frank Erskine's hardware store, where the Royal Bank is now. And then there's a long stairs went up over the bank, and we were going up there, but on the way, this old car was chasing us. I think it was an Essex. And it wasn't going very fast. We could keep ahead of it with the bicycle, with two of us on it. Anyway, and we just hurried and threw the bicycle down up the stairs and told Mrs. Campbell, and she got on the phone wanting to know who this guy was. I think she went down, and who do you think it was? It was Garnet Samus in his Essex. And the smoke would fly out of the back of that thing. We called it the Gutless Wonder. Because it could only do about 35 miles an hour. Later he got a 33 Ford, which smoked just about as bad. But it was a V8, it'd go a little faster. So anyway, the next place along the way would be Frank Erskine had a store right where the Royal Bank is today. And he had a hardware store there. And his mother lived right across from the public school. And anyway, Frank was quite a guy. I think the store before that was some kind of a place where they held shows and things like that. I don't remember that. But and then there was the next place we hit across the street there. I guess would it be Reed Street? And it would be T.C. Young's store. Remember that, John?
Grace Young.
Grace Young was, she was the secretary for the Lakefield Public School for something like 29 years or something like that. Yeah. T.C. Young. And today my nephew's wife runs a little store there with odds and ends. Rachel Sloan. And anyway, we continued down the street there, and there was a furniture store owned by Webster. And then right next to the furniture store was a little wee haberdashy store. It sold about everything, like model airplanes and mostly postcards and a lot of paper, stuff like that, writing paper, envelopes, anything you want. Her name was Molly Thompson. And it was quite a nice little store to go in because you could get a little bit of everything. And I given Derry a couple of postcards from her store tonight. One is of the old bridge in Lakefield, before the steel bridge was even there, down the canal. And there's another picture from that very position looking west, which shows the old restaurant there where Bowes and Cox or somebody is now. And beside that, there's it used to be Hill, Tiny Hill, the Darcy Hill's brother. And of course that was an old homestead at one time. It's been torn down, but it's still in this picture that I gave Derry, this old Tiny Hill store. Anyway, we come along past the furniture store, and there was a store that was called Hull and Porter. It's where the Lakefield Pantry is today, and it was owned by I knew Mucker Hull, or Judson Hull, and he was quite a character. And I think he had Marita and
Jamie.
yeah, he had 2 or 3 children. But anyway, we'd call Mucker up on the phone sometimes just for fun. Remember that? And we'd say, Mucker, have you got, this was tobacco, you got Prince Albert in the can? Oh yeah. We'd say, oh, let him out. And I think they got tired of us calling, because we heard this same story over and over again. And so we move on. I think there was, Fred Wanamaker had a lovely little shop there. He sold good hamburgers. And it burned down, but they built a new place there. It's now where the Chinese restaurant is, I believe. It's made out of blocks, yeah. And Red Wanamaker, his brother, I guess, had a little shoe store right beside it. And one day Red just come home from the deer hunt, and they were all sitting around the back around this old stove, and all talking about all the deer they'd missed, and they hadn't seen any and everything. And a deer jumped right through the front window, through the store, and out the back door. They were all sitting beside the stove there with no gun. Like I used to listen to these stories that the old guys would tell them, because, I don't know, it had some kind of something to do with just a good story, you know. And then, of course, you went on to another store, Butts Northey. Now, Butts was a great guy. I guess in his day he was a good hockey player. And if anybody wanted to get their butt warm, you went into Butts Northey's, because he had a coal stove, and he had a grate about 4 or 5 feet square, and there'd be 3 or 4 people standing over in January, getting warm, getting their butt warm. And Butts was a nice guy. He always talked to everybody, and one thing that I remember him saying one time, his mother lived right, I think, beside Jimmy Simpson across the road here, and Butts, his mother just turned 100, and he was having a big birthday party for her. And what did he do? He went and got $100 bills, and he pinned them all together and put them on the table where they're having the birthday party. I thought, that's kind of quaint, isn't it? But, you know, $101 bills in those days, that was money. That was a lot of money. And she kept the table going, by the way. He didn't take it back to the store. And then we got past Butts Northey, and it'd be Jack Ryan. Jack was a good fellow too, because if we were hitchhiking to town to the old Regent Theater to see, you know, Tarzan and the Apes or something like that, Jack, if you were hitchhiking, he'd give you a ride. He had a 36 Chev, a good car too. And, and then we came along to Archie Stewart's hardware store. And I believe it was, I think in later years, let me see, I forget now, one of the Graham boys, Wes Graham, had a clothing store right along there at one time. And Archie Stewart's hardware, of course. And then there was Warren Payne right on the corner. And some of those old stores, the door entrance was right on the corner, and it was made of a great big cast iron thing, just like when you're into Leonard's hardware store, the same thing, a big cast iron step that you went up there. And it was worn, used to have a kind of raised surface so you wouldn't slip, but it was worn right smooth from people going in there. I don't know how I noticed things like that, but I did. And then there was the post office corner down there. And that post office corner, I still call it the post office corner. And believe it or not, during the war, as high as you could pile stuff, old tires, tin foil, paper, be piled up there 8 feet high for the war effort. We used to go out in the country and collect milkweed pods, bit a bag, for the war effort and bring them down there. And it was a kapok in them they used for life preservers on the boats. That's what it was used for. And I think it was it Tommy Chappell or Chapman ran the old store there, the old post office. And there were different women worked for him in there, some for years. And if you notice that building on the corner, I believe the police are in there now, for no good reason, but they're in there. But if you notice, the foundation up about this high is all made of a very white limestone block. And there's probably all kinds of buildings. The old post office, or the old library in Peterborough had the same stone in it. Foundation of our house today has stone up, the same stone about this high, very white limestone. That stone all came from the 16th line of Smith, the Curve Lake Road going east, down to about Berry Road. You went in the woods there, according to Jack Northey, and it's called the Northey Pit, and that's where all that limestone came from. And today, there's only one guy that knows where it is, and that's Jack Northey. And anyway, across the street, kitty corner, there's I believe a pizza place that moved in there. It used to, Harold Trude had a butcher shop for a few years there. And when I was a kid in the 40s, it was a guy by the name of Simpson had a bicycle shop in there. And we used to call him D.T. Simpson, because he smoked this thing that looked like something a dog would leave on the ground, a little cigar about this long. And so you know what DT stood for. And you know, he always talked bicycles, loved bicycles, and instead of saying the 22nd or something, he always said the 22nd. And it's the first oil stove I ever saw, the old drip oil stove. And they were quite a thing in their day. You had to buy oil and carry the oil in and fill at the back of it. But he had bought an old pot-bellied stove, drilled a hole in the top lid, and he put a flash pan down inside of it there. And I wasn't very old, but I used to like these mechanical things. And sure enough, he would go up to Doug Davis's and get used oil. And he had a 45-gallon drum of oil up in the attic. And he had a copper line running down with a tap off a Model T Ford where he used to check the oil level in the pan. And he used to set that little tap and get it burning down there, and it would just drip, drip through this hole in the top of the stove, and boys, it threw an awful heat. And he got all the oil free from Doug Davis. Doug was trying to get rid of it. So, you know, and then, of course, you come over to W.W. Leonard's hardware store, and that was, all you could smell when you went in there was coal oil, and old floors that were boiled oil they used to put on them. you know, it was quite a good smell, but you smelled a lot of, they stole coal oil up there, and it was quite a story, because they had everything in there. And Jack, his son, worked with him there, and eventually took the business over, and I think Bob McCracken bought into it too then. Anyway, well, I forgot to mention Holland's clothing store. I think they were lovely people, the Hollands, Martin and his wife, and his daughter Ida, went to school with us, Kate. You were Ida? And they think at the time they were the only Jewish people in town, but they were the nicest people, you know. They were very friendly and very good citizens. And as we move up the street there, I forget what all the buildings were, but at one time there was a hydro office at one time. I think it's kind of a bathing suit store there now, kind of up off the street. And then next to that was a small building, and the telephone office was in there. And there was a lot of girls worked in there, the Orr girls, and I don't know, one of the Moore girls. A lot of the people worked in there in town in those days. And then what would be next? There's a great big building there that Hendrins had as a funeral home. I think they sell muffins or something, coffee, a nutshell or something there now. And then, of course, we had come to kind of an important place there. His name was Barney Edwards. He cut hair, and he was character too. He cut it short or long, whatever he wanted. And then I think, then we come along, and then there was a great big building. It would be, before you got to what the commercial inn, they called it, was actually where the hotel is today. The building there was a commercial inn. And Bill Peacock owned it in those days. And Stan Goodall married Pearl, and he had a pool room at the back. And we used to play a lot of pool in there. And going to high school, I could make, some nights I'd make $10 at playing pea pool. And that was big money going to high school, I'll tell you. And, I forgot, just down the street from that, there's a great store there now. There was a jewelry store in there at one time there. I don't know what's in there now. And it was Tanner's Drugstore. And it was the only place that I could buy something that tasted pretty good. It was licorice root. Have you ever seen licorice root? It's almost like a stick of stuff, a twig or something, and you chewed on it, and all the licorice flavor come out in your mouth. It's great stuff. It lasts you all day. Did you spit it out, John? Pretend it was.
You had to have a hole in the front teeth.
Pretend it was tobacco. Yeah. And anyway, there's a lot of stories about that old commercial inn. I'll be going here all night. I could talk about Lakeville, because it was a wonderful place to grow up as a kid, you know. There was all kinds of people here that were just amazing people. And, over this Tanner's Drugstore, Dr. Smith was in town, and he went up a flight of stairs on the left-hand side of the store there, Tanner's Drugstore. And then he moved up onto Chippewa Street after that. And right where the parking lot is beside the hotel today was quite a big frame building. And at one time, Hendrins had a kind of a taxi business there. And later years, Russ Hopkins took it over, and he started selling after the war these Kaiser cars. And then as you moved on up further, there's where Millard's Plumbers moved to it. I don't remember during the war who was in that building. I can't remember. Pardon?
E.J. Millage.
Was he? Well, yeah, but he had a little tinsmith shop right where the parking lot is at first, yeah. And,
There was a Graham in that corner that used to sharpen skids.
yeah.
Arnie Grant.
That was Ernie.
Okay.
You're talking about the place where George
Big
Henry
orange,
stored his caskets and that,
Big
right?
orange.
Not ran his taxi out.
yeah,
That was between Villages and Arnie.
yeah. But then down the street, the other side of the commercial end, I guess on the south side was
That's in the
a
second.
great big frame building, Alfie Hudson, second-hand store. Anybody remember that? Look at the people remember all those good buildings that have been dilapidated, torn down, and wrecked. And Alfie was a character
Alf
too.
didn't tear down and burn down.
You did it? Okay, I remember it anyway, green, painted green. And then I remember one night, I'll tell you about this a little later. I'll save it. Then the other side of the street from that was another car lot run by Don Lloyd. And Don Lloyd, he was a good guy. He had the first speedboat that I ever heard of, and I went right down to the river to watch it go. And would it ever go? It was like an inboard boat, mahogany, and beautiful lines, and probably a lot of horsepower, but it was fast. It was the fastest boat out there until Jerry Northey got a 22-horse Johnson. And it was something to see because it was new, it was fast, you know. Of course, they move on, we come to Doug Davis, one of the big mechanics in this town ever knew, Doug Davis, right on the corner in Queen Street. And for years hired different people like Bill Blewett, Wesley, and Charlton's. And
Jack
then,
Sparkle,
pardon?
Jack Sparkle and
Oh,
Keith
that's right, yeah. Then just down the,
No attention to detail.
and just behind the Don Lloyd's car lot was the creamery. Everybody remembers the creamery? And I believe it was, who lived in the corner?
Charlie Hunter.
Eh? Charlie Hunter ran it for years, and then it was later taken over by George Graham. Yep, that's just one page. There's 11 pages. Do you want to go home then? At this time, Keevan, would you come up for a minute? I'd like Keevan to say, as one of the older people that have known my father for years and years, just a few words about my father, because he's quite a guy. I don't like to brag about him because he's my father.
Thank you, Jim. Over here, Keith. Oh, okay.
You have to talk right into that black thing.
You know, when I was getting ready tonight, I thought Buddy and I were coming, and gosh, this is one night when we won't have to do a thing, just sit there and take it all in. Anyway, I'm glad to respond to Jim's invitation to say a little bit about maybe more than what you think I'd say.
Go ahead, I'll sit down.
Any of you, by the way, is there anybody here who went to school in Lakeville when I did?
When was that?
Long ago. When I come to Lakeville, I'm always looking for some of my classmates or those whom I knew. And you mentioned a few that I knew, but they weren't my classmates. Hoppy Hopkins.
The Wongs? Remember the Wongs?
Oh, need I remember the one, but that'll take too long. I just better say what I think is, for me, worth saying. But I was checking you, Jim, all the way through your story because I knew Lakefield, all those places too. Not as well as you did, but I knew them. I knew Doug Davis, and he fixed the crossbar on my bike twice. Anyway, just this little story, and this is maybe goes in with your history of Lakefield. Any of you remember the Fireman's Ball? You're too young. Nobody. Well, for years, Lakefield, the firemen had a ball on Easter Monday night, which was a dance, really, but they called it the Fireman's Ball. And it was my older brothers who usually played for this dance in the town hall. What do you call that? Memorial?
Memorial Hall.
Memorial Hall. Well, I remember. But what I do remember very distinctly is I was there playing in once, or more than once, because we looked forward to coming. And I don't know whether it was after a dance. You know, in those days you used to dance and then there'd be a break and you get a new partner and...
3 more songs.
That's right, 3 songs, and that dance was over. That kept the crowd mixing, you know. But I don't know whether it was after one of the dances or whether it was an intermission, doesn't matter. But I remember I was up on the stage, or maybe just on the floor in front of it, and this man came walking down towards us, and I don't know whether I knew him before that or not. I think I knew of him. I know I knew of him because he used to teach in, I'll tell you something, Jim.
In Durham.
It was SS number 12, Duro Dummer. And I knew him because he was a teacher, but I don't think I ever met him. And his reason was, he asked me if I would give his sons, Jim, I don't know whether he named them or not. What's your brother's name?
Delmer.
Delmer. I was trying to think of that, and I couldn't think of it tonight.
Charlie Red Dog.
Oh, yes. But we started with Jim and Delmer, and he come down, well, it would be once a week, or I don't know how long. You can tell them about that. But I did give them some help. I was glad to say, yes, sure, if I could. And we did, and I enjoyed Everett Sloan's visit because as well as the little lesson, he was a teacher and I think I was teaching then, but he was way above me. He was the principal of Lakefield Public School and I don't know what I was. But he was telling me, I guess we were discussing school and problems that you might have, or not problems, but incidents. And he was telling me about this boy that took somebody's car. I don't think he stole it. I think he was just taking it for a little joyride. And wouldn't have been the first to do that, I'm sure. I don't know who it was, and I don't want to know. But there was no big harm done. But Everett's response to that was, he told me this, that he told him, if you ever get the urge to do that again, come and take my car. I never forgot that. Because I don't think I'd have done so. And I guess that helped me to admire this man, Everett Sloan, Jim's father. That's enough, Jim.
Well, anyway, I just want to cover a few of the pastimes that some of us boys were involved in when in the 40s when we were younger. And pigeon hunting was one thing. And we'd go to Bob Charlton, and Bob would let us hunt at night with flashlights, catch pigeons. And the only reason we caught them is because old Darcy Hill just loved pigeon pie. Anything we caught, we'd take to him, and he was very happy to get these pigeons. And we would hunt pigeons at the cement works. That's when all the buildings had, mostly had a roof on them, and Lakefield were charging those big taxes because those buildings had a roof on them. And so the cement works finally said, okay, we're going to tear the roof off these places. So they did. And the pigeon hunting wasn't as good then, but when they tore the roof off, they would cut a big hole in the next floor and throw the stuff down this hole. And one night we were hunting pigeons. Of Colin Campbell, Dr. Campbell's son, backed up, went through this hole. I think he went down something like 50 feet, hit his head on a beam on the way down, and he was in serious condition for years with his brain injury. But another night we're hunting at Bob Charlton's there, and Gary McCullough. Anybody remember Gary McCullough? And nobody knows today where he is or where he went. Nobody, even Percy Calvary can't tell me. And anyway, he was coming down out of the barn, and the hay was over the mow like this, and the ladder was here, and you had to be very careful. Anyway, Gary missed the ladder, down he went and broke his wrist. And we got him out to the road, and he just laid there, and his wrist was all bent crooked. Just leave me here to die, he said. Anyway, we didn't do that. We brought him home. And the other thing that went on in Lakefield was down beside the old round boat place there. Now I don't know who owns that now. They just repainted this summer. And it was a great place beside there. It was called the Red Cross had a swimming hole there, and they had a lot of rafts running out, and things you could walk out there to dive off and swim off. And I think one of the teachers was Barbara Brown. She had her life-saving degree, and I think I got up to my senior swimming, and I quit. And but it was a great place. You'd go down there in the morning, and you know your swimming suit and no more, and get dry, and you'd be back in the water again. And stayed there all day. And boy, when you got home at night, were you hungry? And then we had another thing going in town, in the Memorial Hall, which we called the Town Hall, was Teen Town. And every Saturday night, I remember Joyce Hutt and Joyce Patterson, she's passed on too, but she was the disc jockey. She played all the records there, and that was a great place to go. And well, you'd meet girls there too. That was something. You know, when you're 12 or 13, meeting girls, oh boy. Wasn't that nice, Keith? And of course, playing pool at the old commercial inn, that was something else. You could always depend on Archie Sterling, Roger Coons, Amos Quackenbush, Alan McConkey, Clint McCall, etc., etc., etc. And we'd go in there and play people. We played for, I think, 25 cents and 50 cents. You get 25 cents for a kill and 50 cents for a cash. Maybe nobody knows anything about people, but that's the way it worked. And we used to do a lot of fishing, especially in the spring for suckers. We'd go up to Kemp's Creek. Anybody know where Kemp's Creek is? A couple of people do. It's pretty well buried now out there, just outside of town. But the creek runs away out and crosses 507 out there in the sand pit there, just below the cemetery. Crosses there and comes in by Hopkins Motor Sales and circles around. It comes out in the marsh, right not too far from where Ricky Wolford was. And we'd catch these suckers, and we'd build a big fire there, and we'd pack them in mud, just as thick as you could pack it, and put the whole fish on, cleaned right in the coals, and let them cook. And then when the mud was really hard and baked on, we took the salt with us in a fork, and we knocked that mud off, and all the skin and everything would come right off the fish, and we'd just take a fork, put a little salt on it, and eat that fish. Was it ever good? Well, so somebody, you didn't have to have a rod or a line or a hook or nothing. You just and sleigh riding. One of the things we used to do was go down to Charlton's Mill down here, and as soon as Saturday morning was a great time because the farmers all come into town to have their oats ground into chop, and we would sit there and wait till some farmer came along, and we would say, could we have a ride? Of course, he was picking up his chop, and we'd get on with him. He'd say yes, and we'd start riding with him out of town. Well, invariably, as we were going out of town, there'd be another farmer coming in. We'd just switch horses and get on with this other farmer. And we'd do that all morning, all Saturday morning. And if we weren't doing that, we'd set up a box with a stick under it, with a long twine on it, and put a bit of wheat underneath it. And then when the pigeons got out there, we pulled the stick out and we had a pigeon. Yeah, that's some of the things we used to do, like, you know. And does anybody remember the old scows that the Waukeeta used to tow down from Stony Lake?
And Elsie and Denise went into one of those scows that absolutely black pitch, and we were told not to do that.
Yeah.
We walked from one end to the other.
Yeah, there was just a manhole that went down. But I remember as a kid going down, and it was in the same place where the Red Cross had their swimming place, and they built these scows there, and they built them on 2 skidways. I remember there'd be a 2x4, and then a space, and another 2x4, and these skidways were all painted with tallow. And Jim Hull was the main blacksmith at that time, and he lived out Stony Lake Road for years. But I remember they had big heavy planks they planked these things with and fastened them with bolts onto a heavy frame. And then the big job when they got all these planks on was putting oakum between the planks to seal them. And they'd have these wedges and drive this oakum in and oakum in. And anyway, they got it all built and time to launch it. And they had it tied off at each end with a big hay fork rope. And they had a man at each end, and they said, okay, now we're going to launch it. And they gave the whistle, and the guys come down with their axe and cut the hay fork. Well, they cut both and cut the rope nice and clean, and the old scow just sat there. Never moved. And everybody was expecting something big, you know. And I don't know, they got winches on it and price and everything else, about 50 men. They finally got this thing moving. It finally did a bit of a splash when it hit the water. It was really something to see, you know. And then these scows would, I think there were 2 or 3 of them, but they would be towed with the Waukeeta, not behind the boat, but beside the boat, tied sideways to the boat. Apparently they had better steering when they operated like that. My grandfather was a cook on the Waukeeta, Charlie Bone. You know Charlie Bone? He was a cook on the Waukeeta. And my brother went up one day with him, all the way up to the head of Stone Lake. He said it was a nice trip. And then they would bring these scows full of nepheline and cyanide from Blue Mountain, up at Nephin, full of, well, maybe it'd be piled up this high on these scows, and then it would be docked in by Isabel Moore's Parks, right along there, and they would be unloaded by Eric Holmes, the big crane, claw crane with cables. And I think my dad worked shoveling that stuff one summer. He wasn't scared of working. He worked for a farmer, forking hay or something like that. And those scows, the last one I saw was sitting up in Lakefield Marsh, submerged down in there, and it was just full of black snakes, and we were catching the black snakes in there. You did anything for fun in those days, you know. They didn't have these little gadgets. They'd sit there with their thumbs and go like this, you know. Well, that's only page 3. I better quit soon. Oh yeah, oh this is a good story. One time, there's a big hullabaloo going on. I was going down, I don't know, Bridge Street. Is that Bridge Street continue right on? Does it? From the post office corner? Right?
It runs out of town.
Yeah, well, we were going down there and one day near Birch's, and they lived in the corner, and Mrs. Sabatino, that would be Johnny Sabatino's mother, she came over from Italy with them, and she didn't speak a lot of English, but she had locked herself in a house. And they didn't know what to do, so I wandered on down the street there, and here she had got Johnny, and Johnny, by that time, had gained a lot of weight from the time he played hockey, but he was trying to get in the basement window, and he couldn't make it. He was too big. And Mrs. Sabatini was there, and she says, she had another son, Louis. She says, "Oh, go get Louis. Johnny too big and fat." I can remember that just like it was yesterday. And when the train was coming, we always ran going to school. We'd go down Regent Street, and just past where Fred Wanamaker lived, there was a nice path right across the swamp, and then hit right at the bottom of Ermitanger Street, and then on up to school. And it was, the train was coming, we always had a penny we put it on the track. And we'd watch that train run over it, and we were hoping that we'd get back so the engineer wouldn't see us. Of course, we weren't going to derail the train or anything, but when you went over and got your penny after it, it was about this big. Huge, that old train, just the sheer weight of that, on that copper was amazing. And that old swamp, we used to go through there, and one of the things that was difficult in the spring to do was to jump the creek in the swamp there. And many a kid didn't make it, hit the bank, and got a pretty wet foot. Did you, John?
I've been there.
Yeah, so these are just some of the memories, and then we go way down. There used to be, before the train, there was a turntable, because it come from Peterborough up with the train, and then when they had to go back, they had to turn around the engine and back up, pick up all the cars, whatever it was. It might have been anything at all, but they had this turntable down there. And we go down and get on this turntable, and it took 3 or 4 guys to push it around. The rest of them get on it for a ride, you know. Around we go. Along come Joe Deladon. He was out working for the railroad at that time. And he gave us heck because sometimes we leave the turntable so it wasn't lined up so the train would hit it. And if the train tried to come on, he'd be down in the hole. So we got heck for that, but it was fun anyway. He had a little sidecar with an engine on it. And somebody tonight, was it you, John, that had a ride on it? Yeah. And it was a putt, a little sidecar. It wasn't one of these it was a hand car, but you didn't do this. They had a little engine on it. So how far did it take you, John?
We used to go down to Galvin's farm in the
Oh,
morning, just
yeah.
run down, and they called it a jigger.
Yeah, Jigger, yeah. Yeah, that's
A little
right.
house, a
Yeah.
little hut that they
Yeah,
put
they-
in off, right across from where, it's right where the Prince Andrew condominiums are.
Right. So, and that was, we used to have a lot of fun with the train, and we still have a ticket. My mother-in-law used to go to Rochester to do sewing for one of her cousins, and we still have a ticket for the old train that come into Lakefield unused. And she would go on the train, I believe, to Port Hope or Coburg. And there was, let me see, she'd get on a boat to Rochester from there. And there was 2 boats, there were car ferries actually. And I'm working with this guy at GE, and he says, I was talking about these car ferries. Oh yeah, he says, my father was a captain on that car ferry, so it's a small world, you know. And no doubt he went around talking to the passengers. There wasn't many passengers, so my mother-in-law probably had talked to him too, you know, on one of her trips. But she never used this ticket. It's still got it at home there. Unused ticket. What was the name of that railroad then? Grand Trunk?
Grand Trunk.
Yeah, the old Grand Trunk. Yeah. Oh boy. Now here's some stories that was kind of, we thought they were a lot of fun when we were kids, but maybe they were dangerous too, because we'd do anything, and we always stood at the window in the old commercial inn and look out, see what was going on in the main street. And in comes this old Buick convertible, like a 2-door, and there was a whole bunch of girls in it that come from some camp up on Stony Lake. And we thought, oh, that's interesting. So they went into Freddie wanted to make his restaurant to have a hamburger or something. I guess they're hungry. And we went over and we got a block of wood and we just lifted the back end up and put it under the back axle. And anyway, we watch and these girls come back out. And we start talking to them. They get in the car and she started the car and put it in reverse and give it the gas and nothing happened. And tried again, nothing happened. And I said, well, sometimes these cars, you know, if we just give you a little push and get those gears meshing right, it'll do a great job, you'll be all right. So I said, you got to give it quite a bit of gas now. And she gave it quite a bit of gas. And we pushed it off the block. And she just took a complete U-turn in a circle right around like this. And the wheels just screamed. And we kind of got out of there then. She never didn't know what happened. And, you know, here's a guy who was a character in Lakefield. I shouldn't mention names, but Bill Hanrahan. And everybody knew Bill because if you were real small, he would threaten to put you in a bag and take you home. And he even threatened my wife. He wanted to take her up to South Beach. She said, I wouldn't go anywhere with you, you old so-and-so. And of course, she went home and she was boarding at Harold Trude's, and Mary said, oh, that's just Bill Hanrahan. she knew right away who it was. But Bill, he had a hard time. He had to stay out in the cold weather, like this kind of weather. He wanted to get somewhere where it was warm for the winter. And quite often he'd get up in front of Judge Langley, or Magistrate Langley, and for just some small incidents, and he'd send us to Mimico or someplace, and Bill would spend a couple of good warm months in one of those jails, you know. And anyway, he's up in front of Magistrate Langley, and everything that Magistrate Langley said, he'd say, pardon, Your Honor, pardon, Your Honor. And Magistrate Langley had to repeat himself, and repeat himself, and repeat himself. And he says, did you do this, Bill? Is that right, Bill? Pardon, Your Honor, pardon, Your Honor. This went on quite a while. And finally, Bill, the Magistrate Langley says, Bill, that'll be 30 days in Mimico. Oh, he says, you're pretty free with another man's time. And Magistrate Langley says, yes, you heard that, didn't you, Bill? But Bill, you know, he went behind Alfie Hudson's one night and he had a bottle of wine and he hid it back in there, and then he come into the commercial inn. And somehow Samus lived right next door. Well, I guess he lived where Barney Edwards had his barber shop, and he saw Bill do this. So Samus, what did he do? He went back, poured the wine out, and filled her full of cold tea. Oh boy, Bill was mad. But the funniest thing that happened with Bill, he came in the commercial inn, he had a pipe with the stem broken off it. And it would just, the bowl would sit under his nose, and he called it his nose jammer. Because it kept his nose warm, he said. But anyway, he sat beside Roger Coons up at right in the restaurant there. And he said to Roger, you wouldn't have any tobacco, would you? Roger said, oh yeah, just a minute, I'll go out to the car and I'll get you some. So he went out and he got some fine cut tobacco and he filled Bill's pipe right up full of this fine cut tobacco. And he even gave him a match to light it all up. And anyway, Bill's just smoking this nose jammer of his, and he's really having a good smoke, you know. And all of a sudden, things didn't smell very good. Oh, it was awful. The restaurant just stunk. And that Roger Coons had gone out and got some of this dry manure on the street. And for the first half inch of that pipe was just solid manure, and the rest of it was fine cut. Well, out come the owner. You knew who that was, Stan Goodall. And he grabbed Bill and he ejected Bill out of the restaurant. Didn't want him in there smoking that kind of pipe. So Bill was a nice old guy. You could stop and talk to him, and we had a conversation. He was a nice guy. Harmless, completely harmless. And,
Shoveled a lot of fog.
eh?
He shoveled a lot of fog.
Well, yeah, I did, and so did, there used to be a guy in Warsaw that, he was good on the fog too. It was Alan Bell's father. Do you remember him? Alan Bell's father in Warsaw. Anyway, he always told a lot of stories. He said one time he was shingling there, I guess wooden shingles, he said, he kept going, he said, it was a real foggy day, he says, I wondered why the darn nails were driving so easy. But he says, I was 4 feet out into the fog, he said. But, you know, one time, there was a guy that lived across from Melody Inn. It's not there anymore. It's a restaurant out where the Stony Lake Road meets 28. And there's a guy across the road. He worked there, or lived there, and I think his name was, we call him Potato Joe, but I think his name was Edwards, so Percy Calvary tells me. And he'd park in the old United Church sheds, his horse and buggy, and then you could cut right through to the commercial inn. You could walk right through there. There's a nice walkway there. And so we saw him coming through there, and we thought, aha. So we got some wire and a pair of pliers, and he had parked beside this post in the shed, and we wired the back wheel right to the post in the shed there. And then we watched till he come out. He'd bought something uptown, and he went back in his buggy. And he got in that buggy, and I don't know the names. He called that horse because it wouldn't back up. Finally, he heard us laughing. I think he thought there's something going on here, and he went out and checked and took the wire off the wheel anyway. That's a true story. There's another one that isn't that nice for people who love nature, but young Montgomery, David Montgomery, I hate mentioning names like this, but I was just as bad as he was sometimes. Sometimes maybe worse, I don't know. But he was standing on the old steel bridge over at the going up town here, and he had a fishing rod in his hand, and I said, what are you fishing for, guy? He says, nothing. I says, what are you doing? And he had a line all right. It was on the end of the line. He tied a piece of raw bacon. And the seagulls loved that. And he'd wait till the seagull took it and swallowed it. And then he'd give it a little jerk. And the seagull would fly way up in the air, and he'd let mine out. And just as soon as he got high enough, he'd give it a real good jerk. And I guess he'd just spin the old seagull like this. You know, it was kind of a cruel thing to do. But he was having fun. He didn't hurt the seagull. He buried back for another piece of bacon. And oh, and one thing we used to do a lot was travel the old railroad line out to Buckley's Lake. We'd go all the way right from the cement works. And at one time, at the top of the cement works hill, there was a kind of electric railway car sitting there. And as far as I can make out at the quarry, where they quarried limestone out near Highway 28, they had an electric shovel out there to handle this, and I think maybe that's what it was. And they had an electric line all the way out to that quarry from the cement works. But it was still there in the 40s, this old shovel. And we played a lot of hockey out at on the Buckley's Lake, because there was all these cuts out there where they dredged for the marl, and it would freeze over, and the kids would come up from Duro there, and Sunday afternoon we played shinny all afternoon. That was just some of the things that we used to do for fun. I didn't bring this thing tonight, but here's a story. Where I live now, it's on down the Curve Lake Road about a half a mile. I was down between the house and the lake. There's like a swale hole, like what I call a swampy area, which is quite soft. And I was down there one day. I seen this shiny object shining. I picked it up, and it was a hubcap. So I took it up to the driving shed, and I hung it up on a nail in the driving shed. And Walter Trude was Melba's uncle. He was raised on the farm where I live today. He was visiting one day, and he says, "Where did you get that hubcap?" I told him, I says, "Just between here and the lake in that low area down there." "Oh," he says, "I just realized the other day where that hubcap came from." And I said, "Where?" "Well," he says, "back in the 20s, a man came to the house, and that's where I now live. He said, could I get someone to guide me?" And in those days, there was a lot of Americans come up here in the 30s and would hire a guide to fish. And they always had a big Cadillac. They didn't own it, they just rented it. And they had these big, sharp-pointed white boots on too. And anyway, he said this guy was driving a car. He said it must have been 22 feet long. He said it must have weighed 1.5 tons. And when they went to go fishing, he insisted they drive this car to the lake. And Walter says, "No," he says, "you can't get through that mud down there." He says, "You sure as heck get stuck." But anyway, he said, "Okay, you can drive her if you wanted." So he got down into the bloody hole there. He went and he got stuck all right. And they took four teams of horses to pull that car out, Walter said. Now maybe you're exaggerating a little bit, I don't know. But no, he said, "I know exactly where that hubcap came from." He says, "When I read in the paper about this Patty Hearst being kidnapped or something," he says, "it just struck me. Because this old guy that was there, he said that he owned the Chicago Times. And in this article about Patty Hearst, it said her grandfather was William Randolph Hearst. So I still have the hubcap there off this old Pierce Arrow car. So old Hearst was right down my laneway, down the lake fishing, right on some lake called Mud Lake then. So it's a bit of just a story I don't want to tell you about this, about nothing. And I was upstairs the other day and I found a book. Here it is here. And it's called Lost in the Backwoods by Mrs. Trail. I believe she was one of the Stricklands that wrote this book. And I read the story, and it's really a nice story. So if you ever get a chance, read it. And it's about 3 children who lost in the woods south of Royce Lake. Now, we were visiting one of Melba's cousins, Ferris Cole, who was a granddaughter of Fred Walden. That'd be, grandfather. And anyway, I talked to the Everett Cole, her husband, about this book. And he told me he was raised on the same property where these 3 children were raised in this book. And it's a good story. It's really a wonderful story about how these kids survived all over a year in the bush by themselves. They're only 12 years old. Now, I'm digging around the house one day, and I come up with this thing here. Doesn't look like much, does it? But this is over 100 years old. It's all made from walrus tusk and pegged with walrus tusk. It probably has some kind of bone or something on the front of it. There's a spear handle goes in. Spear goes in here. It's tied back to this tether so you won't lose your spear. And then there's a large rope tied to the spear and wrapped around here. And what it is for spearing white whales or whatever, a seal, whatever. And this came from the Arctic, near the Arctic Ocean. And the only person I could ever think of that might have had that and how it ended up at our house would be through Melba's grandfather, Mr. Trude. Now he owned I believe he was in the Masons, and he was a great friend of George Douglas. George Douglas went to the Arctic in 1913 when there wasn't even maps up there. And in the book about George Douglas's adventure there, called The Copper Mine, you want to read that book. It's a beautiful book. All the pictures were taken by George Douglas in the book. And in the book, there's a bunch of Eskimos standing there with all their tools. And there's one guy standing, I believe, with this spear. It just looks identical. And the only place it could have come from, George, he brought different articles home. And some of the copper he did find up there is at Trent University Cave. And other articles he brought home with him.
About half a dozen articles.
Yeah, and I think that maybe he had given this to Melba's grandfather somehow. But it's quite an interesting story about his adventures to the copper mine. But it's kind of live history when you look at some of these articles, like the hubcap or the spear. It all relates to some of the old people who were, very interested in history and adventure. Now, here's another article here. I don't think anybody knows what it is. I do. My father gave it to me, and he says, Jim, he said, this is something I got from my grandfather, and where it came from, we needed some lumber at the Dummer homestead, and a man by the name of Blake owned a blacksmith shop in Norwood, and that blacksmith shop was eventually taken over by Earl Cuthbertson, one of my cousins. And when they were taking the planks off the floor in the old blacksmith shop, I believe the building's still there today. This article was found hanging on the beams, the floor joist. Just with a nail here and a nail there, it was hanging there. And I guess my grandfather picked it up and didn't know what it was. And he was a blacksmith and on his own accord. But anyway, my dad says, don't let anybody see you with this thing. It's illegal to own this. And what do you think it is, Neil? Do you want to take a look at it? You got good glasses? Take a
Pretty
look.
good glasses, but I haven't got a very good imagination.
Take a look inside. Well, you don't need, you just got to look. Take a look inside this.
You can make a tubey with it.
There's two sides to it. What is it?
Oh, it's a coin maker.
Yeah.
It's a,
What's the date on it? It's backwards, it'd be a mirror image.
oh yeah, it's backwards. Is it Queen Victoria?
Yeah.
And you could press that into some metal and
50 cent
you'd be
piece?
one of the best counterfeiters in Dummer
Not me, I'm not in Dummer. Anyway, it's for 1875, 50 cent piece.
That's really something.
It's got a copper plate inside of it. And Dad had it for years and he just passed it on to me just as a keepsake. I don't think they'd put me in jail today for it, would they?
And he wouldn't go very far now.
So you can have a look at it after if you want. Some of these articles.